thank you for that very, very tepid welcome. Little joke. It's good to be here, and it's terrific to be discussing in open something that's often hidden. So I congratulate the organisers of putting this on. Only one or two of you I know personally. I still feel curiously like I'm among my own. I think that's probably for the fact that I'm married to Lisa Wilkinson, who you may remember from Today's Show and now co-hosting the project. I'm told by many of my mates the fact that I'm married to Lisa makes me the president of the Australian Men Punching Well Above Their Weight Club. And I'm delighted to see so many of my fellow members here today. So in terms of mental health, I have been blessed in my life that I haven't suffered from depression. I've gone through, sailed on through, but it's been around me. And my father was one that had depression. I never knew about it until Dad was about 70 years old and I was 29 or 30 years old. We've had depression in my extended family. We've lost one of our family members in my extended family. So I've seen it up close to the devastation that can be wrought by issues of mental health. In terms of my journalism, I thought I might begin by telling one story of mental health that I've always treasured, this particular story. And her name was Nellie Bishop. And she was in the early part of last century. She was a young woman from Lithgow and she was in love with a young man from Lithgow. And he went away to war in 1917, and on the Western Front a bullet came and it didn't kill him, but it took away his genitalia. And he came back marching back from war, and she loved him, he loved her. Her dearest wish was to have children. They couldn't have children, and one thing led to another. They broke up. And the end of the story, not the end of the story, but in 1921, the witnesses at the Gap at Watson's Bay see this beautiful, beautiful young woman in a billowing black dress step to the edge of the Gap and without hesitation placed down her black purse and not will I, won't I, hurled herself to the rocks below at the Gap at Watson's Bay at Sydney, a famous suicide spot. By pure chance, in the time it took from getting from the top to the cruel rocks below, a surge of the ocean came in, and instead of hitting those rocks and losing her life, she hit 6 foot of water, and 2 Sicilian Australian fishermen were there fishing there. By their account, it was a reverse Mary Poppins, that they can see this screaming and woman, billowing black dress, hits the water. They risked their lives to go in, pluck her from the water. They got her from, they said, within 6 foot of the cliff. They got her to Watson's Bay Police Station. They called her parents in Petersham. They came to get her. She spent the night in St George Hospital. And the punchline of the story is that instead of dying in 1921, as she thought, at the age of about 21, she died in 1989, at the age of nearly 90. Mother of 8, grandmother of 26, great-grandmother of 54. The point being that at that moment, she thought, at the moment that she hurled herself from the cliffs at Watson's Bay, she thought her life was over, there was nothing to live for, that the best thing that she could do was to end her life. And I put it in the paper, and 7:30 Report picked up on it, Malcolm Turnbull picked up on it, who was the local member. I said that at the Gap, there should be, Chifley's light on the hill should be a statue of Nellie Bishop with a light, so that anybody that would want to lose their life, to take their own life at the Gap, that they could see that, and there'd be a statue of Nellie and her story to say she too thought that there was nothing to live for, she was wrong, look at her story. And I might say that Malcolm Turnbull was very strong in supporting it. Sadly, Woollahra Council, their point was if we put a plaque to everybody that took their life at Watson's Bay, we'd have nothing but plaques. And the answer to that was she didn't take her life. Hers was an inspirational story. So what we're talking about today is with men, particularly with men's mental health. And I'll just reprise my remarks outside to the journalist. As I say, I'm blessed to have been without serious problems of mental health, but I'm a great admirer of Are You OK Day. I think that in my experience, and I'm not a mental health professional, I'm by no means a mental health expert, but as a close observer over the years, it has been my very strong view that the major danger of issues with mental health comes down to isolation, comes down with remoteness, that salvation through mental health issues lies with connection to the people around you. In the case of my father, it was my mother that saved him and his family, the tight family around him that saved him. And where it gets dangerous is where people don't talk about it, where people are remote. But my major job today is to facilitate, not to spout. So we're joined by Allan Sparkes and Grant Edwards, two men who've had 20 years and 30 years in the police force, respectively, and also I'm sure respectfully, but who've had huge achievements and are known as strong men. Grant, at one point, was crowned the strongest man in Australia for hauling locomotives and planes forward, purely by the strength in his legs and arms, and yet has had serious issues with mental health. Allan also enormously commended medals for bravery, the highest civilian recognition for bravery, has that on his record for going down. He'll tell us the story. But both men have had serious issues with mental health. So I'll start with you, Allan. Perhaps you would tell us something of your story, of your background, your achievements, the trauma that you faced and when you first realised that you had an issue with mental health and how you tackled it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pete. And again, thank you everybody for being here and showing your interest. Very basically, I joined the police force as a 19-year-old kid. I was a shearer before I joined the job. Spent a long time working in the rural area. Went to Sydney and started my career at King's Cross and Darlinghurst, which was a bit of a cultural shock for me. But for many years of being an operational police officer in uniform, then becoming a detective and working in areas of high crime, the CIB, the thought or prospect of being mentally unwell never ever crossed my mind. And I never considered that I could ever end up mentally unwell. I certainly never contemplated that I could ever become suicidal. And I became married to another police officer. Deb was a detective as well. She was working in the Child Protection Unit, investigating sexual and physical abuse of young children. So she had a challenging career path. And in 1993, Deb and I went to Paris, where we were married, and we spent 5 months riding our push bikes around Europe. So I came back from that time, physically and psychologically, I would suggest, the strongest I've ever been in my life. 3 years later, I'm walking to the bathroom at the police station with my revolver in my hand, and I was literally seconds away from ending my life. It's just the fact that a colleague walked in and saw the gun in my hand and took it from me that I didn't end my life there and then. So, with the benefit of hindsight, I wanted to know why did I end up so catastrophically unwell psychologically, and how did I want to end my life? So I've been able to analyse that, and I realised that my pathway was a progression from being so fit and healthy to being in this terrible state. And that's what I've learnt so much about, Peter, is why I became so unwell. What did I contribute to becoming unwell, and how is it today, all these years later, I am enjoying such brilliant physical health and exceptional mental health? How was I able to pull myself back from that? And there's some of the things I'd really like to talk about today. Can
I ask you how you spiralled down, so from being at the peak of your physical and mental powers to the point that you had the gun in your hand? What was the process going lower and lower?
The first part was coming back to work and suddenly becoming involved in this exceptional investigation, and the workload was phenomenal and very challenging. Essentially, an Aboriginal man had been framed about a crime that was committed, and I didn't believe that he had done it, so I had to spend 6 months proving this man didn't commit this crime before I could prove who it was. So there's a lot of conflict with my commanders. The workload was excessive. I stopped exercising as much as I used to. I started drinking more, I started smoking more. My diet changed dramatically. I was just eating on the go, and I wasn't sleeping. I was continually under pressure, and I think that was probably the major factor, was the lack of sleep I was getting.
And what did your wife, who's observing this closely, what did she say?
I think it was just accepted. Well, that's part of the job as a cop. You know, you're working long hours, you're working hard. And she had a very traumatic and challenging career path for herself. And then in 1995, I was involved in an incident at Crescent Head where 2 of my colleagues were ambushed and murdered. And I led a team in that night to do some emergency action work to rescue people who the commanders believed the government was going to murder next. And one of those colleagues was a good mate of mine, was also a good friend of Deb's. And when sunlight came and we've eventually found the gunman, he'd taken his own life. And to sit down with Pete, my mate, was just an experience that I never thought I could ever see. A dead policeman laying in front of me, or two dead cops. But and there was a lot of conflict developed from that. And because I was so chronically stressed at the time of Crescent Head, I had no resilience to overcome the trauma that I was experiencing. And the conflict compounded my chronic stress. And then a few months later, I was involved in the rescue of a little boy who'd been swept 600 metres down a storm water pipe. And I nearly drowned in that rescue. It was a successful rescue. We saved his life. But that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. From that point, analytically, I realised that I had developed full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, there's a lot of conflict. And I developed the classic symptoms of being suicidal. And that is you have an overwhelming sense of hopelessness, that you'll never get better. You feel so worthless. I felt such shame and guilt. My brother had been paralysed playing rugby union many years before.
Why shame?
That I couldn't cope.
And I'm meant to be a strong man, and I can't cope, and
Correct.
so that's shameful. Why guilt?
I think guilt because my brother was able to manage his injury and his life so brilliantly, and I thought, gosh, he's a quadriplegic in a wheelchair and getting on with his life, and here I am, can't even cope with this situation.
All right, I'll ask you to leave it there. We'll go to Grant. And again, if you can take us through your background and then get us to that point where you were in a similar situation.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Peter. Similar to Allan in terms of the overall aspect, but I'm, as opposed to Allan, I'm in the Australian Federal Police. I still am serving. I'm just on long service leave at the moment, which is wonderful. And I've been in the AOP for about 34 years. Like Allan, mine was cumulative, but mine also transgressed back, right back to my childhood, which until I came out of what I call the fog of mental illness, I really never had the opportunity to analyse what had happened in my childhood. So I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. At a young age, my father declared that he was gay, which back in the 70s wasn't a good thing to sort of have on your CV, especially as a child. I was about 8 years old at the time. I didn't quite know what that meant, but I saved him the embarrassment of having to explain to me what that was like, saying, look, I know all about it, it's okay, you know, you're my dad, etc. That caused an awful, if you like, traumatic event for my mother. My mother competed with her sister, who was Miss Palm Beach, very attractive model. When she found my father, which the alarm bell should have rung. He's very well dressed, very well presented, smelt nice, could ballroom dance, could cook, could do all that.
Hang on a minute.
I was going to say,
I think we're straying into the field of stereotypes here.
No, exactly. But we're talking about the 70s, Peter. Right. Yeah. So that was my first introduction. That caused my mother to become heavily reliant on alcohol. And she subsequently died as a result of that at a fairly young age, at the age of 47. But in the meantime, I had become very close to her father, my grandfather, who, when I was about 10 years old, committed suicide. And my mother's brother, his son, was in the New South Wales Police Forensics. I happened to stumble across the photo of his suicide where he hung himself when he was in hospital. So a couple of traumatic events. I never thought much more about it beyond that, but following on from there, I had my own situations. I was pretty severely beaten by a bunch of thugs when I was about 12 years old. I always looked a lot older than I was. It was an initiation process back in the days. If those that are old enough remember the Sharpie groups, I was at a bowling alley with my sister and they just come up and beat me, broke my nose and did things like that. Had a series of events over a period of time, but I dealt with that. I was young. Joined the police in 1985.
Did you go looking for a bunch of thugs on your first day out?
Well, no, actually I didn't. Before I joined the police, I'd done a bit of work everywhere. I'd been at university in Hawaii. I worked as a security, as bouncer. I got to learn to talk to people. I wasn't revengeful in that sense because I looked at the positive side and it taught me a thing or two, being beaten up. like that. I've never ever been that kind of person in terms of using my size. But joined the police, and the one thing that and what Allan talked about, when you join the police, they bring you to the peak of physical fitness. They teach you about the law. They teach you how to handcuff people. God forbid, they teach you how to shoot people. You're taught everything, but you're not taught about what you may be exposed to over a lifetime or a career. It's almost a taboo. It's like, you get on, you do the job. I personally became an oxymoron. I was this big, physical, strong guy. At my peak, I was about 160 kilos. And as Peter said, I could do a lot of things. So I was very proud of my physical fitness and my ability to be able to keep physically strong. But the events of my youth, coupled with when I moved into child exploitation and the exploitation of women and children.
I'll just explain that with child. It's a unit where you were going after child pornographers and the rest. So you were exposed, pedophiles. So you were exposed to shocking images and things in this world that the rest of us never can imagine. You were dealing with it in your daily professional life.
And that's all we did. At that stage, we didn't have the legislation federally to prosecute those people. So what we had to do is, if you like, triage the images that were coming through to see what we considered to be abuse, and then we had to send that over to the Communications Authority, who had the authority to declare it as child pornography. Then we could go and investigate it. But when you're sitting in front of a computer screen, 24/7, almost felt like that, watching image after image of children being abused. And I'll spare you the details, but you could imagine some of the things that you get to see. And we only had a small group of people. And
excuse me for interrupting, but looking back upon that, was your mental process, or like this world that I'm living in and I'm seeing this image, this is going on in the world that I live in, I don't want to be a part of this world?
Yeah, you start to build a jaundiced view being a police officer, because you're dealing with a small percentage of the worst of society. Your mind turns to the fact that becomes society. So you have a skewed view of the world. And that sort of happens naturally. And you build a definite inherent of distrust. You just have this distrust of everything because you don't trust anybody, because you're taught. Don't trust what they're saying because what they're saying is a lie. The only people you're meant to trust are the people that you work with.
And at what point did you slide into, and is that again, because you're both, I'm very aware with my use of language, and I invite you particularly, Allan, as a Commissioner of Mental Health, if I stray into the wrong language, please correct me. So I said slide into mental illness, I'm not sure if that's right. But at what point, if it's the correct terminology, did you start to slip downwards into mental illness?
Looking back on it now, very shortly after that. But
very shortly after what?
After I'd worked in that unit, around probably 2004.
Right.
And again, at the time, I didn't know. I just thought, I'd been working hard, lack of sleep. I'd sort of stopped training because of the volume of the work. We just didn't have the time. Very similar to Allan's story. But I just thought I was getting old, I was getting tired. It's just normally what happens. Distant. Now I look back on it, I'm hitting all the markers of anxiety, depression, and then of course the PTSD with the poor sleep. I turned to alcohol, and alcohol to me was a demon because of what happened to my mother and my grandfather. I wasn't a drinker, but I took to self-medication. Alcohol was the only way I could stop my head and then allow me to sleep.
And would it be that if you were at this level with alcohol, having the alcohol would lift you up, but then when it worked off, you were at a lower level? Is that generally the rule? If you're using alcohol to get through, that you finish at an eternally lower level?
Yeah.
I think also we use alcohol to get us to sleep.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think for you, mate, with me, sometimes your head's so full of stuff that you don't want to see, you can't stop seeing, and you use that alcohol to try and get you to sleep.
Right.
And that obviously has a reverse effect, because we know now scientifically if we drink alcohol it's going to wake us up anyway. And it is a depressant. So the abuse of alcohol that Grant and I shared was such a negative as far as any chance of recovery was concerned.
Right.
It's absolutely the wrong way to go.
And take us, if you could, to your lowest point, and then I want to start the happier part of both of you climbing up the other side. So where was your lowest point?
My lowest point would have been around about 2014. We had G20, and I was responsible up in Queensland for basically making sure that all those aircraft that were coming in, security, etc. and I was struggling. By that stage, the demons, for a better word, were full blown in my head, and my wife and many people believed that I was suffering post-traumatic stress. My doctor had told me that he thought I had post-traumatic stress. He gave me a prescription. I went back the next day, stood over him, said, "Take it, mark it off my file. I don't want that on my file because of the stigma, because I'll lose my job if..."
You said to him, "Get that off my file."
Yeah, I stood over him and said,
What, as
"Take it
late
off
as
my file."
2014,
Yeah.
it was still a stigma
Oh yeah, it
to
still
have
is
that
now.
on your, marked on your cards, this man has got post-traumatic stress.
It still is now. It's better than what it was, but it still is. Yeah. But I'd got to the stage at that time that I was so distant from everyone. I distanced myself from my family. The only way that I saw that this could be fixed was just to leave this earth. And I, I didn't go the gun way. I had a close friend of mine who worked for me who took his life that way. And I remember the impact that it had on people. I was lucky enough that I could recall this, but I'd actually designed a car accident.
Okay, but I don't think we should be too graphic.
No, not going to be graphic.
All right.
I'm just, like Allan had the weapon, I had a car accident. The reason I did that was for insurance purposes,
right,
so that it wouldn't be considered to be because of mental health. So
I don't want to give anybody ideas of any, we've got to be careful. But give me the happy part of you're both at your lowest level. How did you start to climb up the other side?
I think there's a misconception, Peter, that two things. One is all you've got to do is speak up, and all you've got to do then is seek help.
Right.
We, as men particularly, we're not going to speak up. And secondly, help is a misunderstood term. For me, to be put before a psychiatrist was so humiliating and so devastating. It wasn't suddenly, "Oh, thank God I'm seeing a clinician, it's all going to be good." It's like, "Oh, I'm here in a psychiatric unit with a psychiatrist asking me whether I want to live or die." And the agreement was that I had to see that psychiatrist 3 days a week in the town that I was living. The psychiatric unit was also the methadone clinic. So I would sit in the waiting room with all the heroin addicts who I'd arrested and charged, waiting to see a psychiatrist while they were waiting to get their methadone. So for me to actually leave home to go and get help was a very, very challenging, traumatic experience.
I just want to explore when you said we're men, we don't ask for help. Why do you specifically say that? Why is it a gender thing that men don't ask for help? Is it because we're meant to be stereotypically the strong ones?
I think, yes, for Australian men, I think we are a very strong breed of people. I think for first responders, we have to have a very strong sense of resilience and strength that we don't want to share the agony we're going through. We don't want others to suffer what we're suffering. So it's a self-protection method, but also we want to protect others. And, you know, it drives me to insanity, pardon the pun, that we keep trying to just say, well, just speak up. It's not easy to do. And when you are so agonised internally with mental illness, the last thing you want to do is talk about how horrible you feel.
Right.
So it's contra. So for me, having to be with the psychiatrist was very challenging. I knew if I didn't get clinical intervention, my life would end. I wanted to prove to my wife that I wanted to live and wanted to get better. I took the medication that I was prescribed for a certain time. It was very, very challenging to take the medication because it was so strong. And it took a long time for me to accept the help and understand it was actually helping. But just because you suddenly go to a clinician, don't think that suddenly you're going to get better. And I think a lot of people, they go to a clinician and their partner, their spouse or whatever goes, "Oh, thank God they're getting help, they must be better now." For me, it took many years to recover. It was a slow process.
All right, Grant, your climb back.
And climb back is probably a good analogy because I'm not sure whether you actually ever reach the top. You know, you get close. I mean, I'm on a good pathway now, but it took me time. But what it took me to do was to take ownership. I see too many people that expect others to take ownership on your behalf.
Right.
It's very, very hard because you're so conflicted internally. Again, I didn't know what was wrong. I kept thinking it was a physical manifestation. There's a comorbidity with mental health and physical health, and I'm certainly an example of that.
There's a what?
Comorbidity. So essentially...
What does comorbidity mean?
So it means that there's, in this case, often mental health trauma will cause a physical,
right.
A similar physical response. So I spent a year in Afghanistan as a police officer, and on the return from Afghanistan, I was physically and mentally tired. Within probably, I mean, we were attacked. We had, all the things that you heard about Afghanistan. But what happened to me was I became absolutely physically exhausted. I had inflammation. I couldn't pick up my daughter. I couldn't hold a cup of coffee. And I don't know what I'd done wrong. I don't know what caused it. I won't go into the depths of it. But I was later told by my psychologist that that's very simple. That's the brain saying you're not acknowledging that you've got issue. Your brain is trying to stop you by putting these physical...
How did you get to the point of the psychologist? So in Allan's case, it was his wife basically saying you've got to go and see an intervention. Was it an intervention with you?
Not so much an intervention, but pretty much the same. My wife. I had a distrust of psychologists. I spent time with many of them. I'd also seen my father, who undertook the Chelmsford process, for those that are old enough, where he had the implants in the brain, and in the hospital he was with psychologists, and psychologists and psychiatrists didn't rate highly in my... I just didn't want to see them. But I got to the stage where I was so physically exhausted, I'd almost given up, and I wrote... I was actually sitting in the US under a tree crying, wrote a letter to my wife, or an email, saying this is what I'm feeling, because that was the only way that I was able to properly communicate. And it was like I'd taken ownership that I had a problem. And I then thought, you know what, I don't care what people think. I knew people always saw me as a strong guy, could do this, do that, but I was mentally weak inside. But I got to the stage where I said, I don't care what people think. I resigned myself to the fact my career was over because, I'd lose my security clearance, etc. They take the gun, they do all that. All the things that we see and we hear day in, day out from police. And I took ownership. I didn't expect the organisation to do it. I went and sought my own help. I sought a psychologist who was a sports psychologist from Canberra who I trusted and knew, and she set me on the pathway of at least getting me moving to be able to start to go in a positive space.
And I don't want to go into your files, but in that, and I don't want to be too personal, but you then sit with her and you talked about your childhood, you talked about Afghanistan, you talk about the things you've seen. Yeah. And she sets you on the path to redemption, to getting stronger. What were the steps along that path? First, you've got to get off the grog, mate. Then you've got to do, is it that kind of a thing?
No, it was really tools. It was a set of tools. It was never, don't do this, don't do that. It was like, these might be helpful for you. So first of all, mindfulness, living in the moment. As police, we never live in the moment. You're always looking about what's ahead, what's next week, what you're doing. You don't stop and smell the roses. And when she said that to me, and I remember leaving the office and I walked out into the Canberra autumn and I thought, I can smell the roses, I can see things. And not being hard on yourself. Acknowledge that, this it's not something that you asked for. It's not something that was thrown upon you. But because I took ownership of it, I guess in her words, I was a very good student. I sucked the information out of her.
I can see Allan nodding knowingly. It's interesting as you two go, you're going, that's right. And there's a few, but there are a few people in the audience too that I can see going that. I haven't seen anybody violently shaking their head saying, no, that's nonsense. But go on with your experience. So you then get psychiatric, psychological, both?
With a psychiatrist. Okay,
so then you've been on the process, you're now a professional in the field. What are the things you've learned?
Oh, well, the pathway was a bit up and down. The psychiatrist was able to explain to me that I needed to rebuild myself physically as a process to rebuild myself psychologically. So I was able to then start my exercise regimes and cutting out alcohol and caffeine, eating better, Sleeping was critically important. And I was trying so hard to get better to go back to work because my work was my life for me. And 18 months later, I got a phone call from headquarters saying, congratulations, your last day of work was 2 weeks ago, see you later. So after 20 years of giving your life to your career, factually, I'd been the first police officer to ever be awarded Australia's highest civilian bravery decoration, the Cross of Valour. And I was just thrown out with the dishwasher. So that was a very challenging time for me, and I had to essentially rebuild again. So what I know now, Peter, is that an essential element of my recovery and the recovery of people who have mental illness, particularly men, is refinding your sense of worth. And I did a lot of things to look for my sense of worth. When I eventually found it, that I would suggest was the most critical moment in my overall recovery. And being able to analyse why did I become so ill has allowed me to accept it. And I've learnt from those mistakes that I made, so I'm very careful now that I don't do things that will damage me physically and or mentally.
I really liked what you said to me in the car about not being reactive to mental health, being proactive.
Correct.
And actually, as you explained it to me in the car, if you live a psychologically healthy life, the psychological health will follow. So
yeah, and so now I'm very heavily engaged with first responders, particularly the police force, about identifying the physiological risks that they face, which we all face. All of us today face physiological risks. It's just that first responders are exposed to more traumatic events. But technically, we all face the same physiological risks. And how do we minimise those risks? Is that we become proactive. We have to take great care of ourselves. We have to accept responsibility for ourselves. And we have to work very hard at it, because today's lifestyle is so different to what it used to be. And we are all under so much pressure from so many different angles. And we can very easily go from being stressed to chronically stressed. And if you're chronically stressed, it's very easy to slip then down the path to mental illness. So how do we stop becoming chronically stressed? For me, is one of the most important things we need to do in this country, is give people the tools, the knowledge and the skills to minimise the risk of becoming chronically stressed. If we do that, I believe we will reduce the incidence of mental illness.
I want to go, thank you, I want to go to Grant, nodding vigorously. You were nodding most vigorously when he said we've got to reduce the chances of falling into that. I mean, for you, what are the things that we need to know of if we feel like we're starting to descend? What are the things we need to do?
For me, that was absolutely resonating what Al was saying, but the greatest lesson that I've learned is it's okay. It's okay to have it. When I say it's okay, it's not a condescending term, but it's okay if you're suffering a mental trauma.
There is no stigma.
There is no stigma. And like Alan said, you know, you can't just go and start talking to somebody, because you need to talk to people that you trust. And depending upon what state you're in, but by taking ownership of it and saying, like you would if you break your arm, you know, you know what you have to do. You've got to go and get your arm fixed. But people see that external. They don't see the internal turmoil that you're going through. But acknowledging that it's okay, and then when you're at that stage where you're thinking of suicide, you're becoming very selfish. And that's what was the circuit breaker for me. But when you're getting better, you also have to be selfish too. Because in order for you to get better, in particular for your loved ones and your family, you've got to invest the time in you initially to get yourself to that stage where, like Alan said, and like I did, I end up marathon running. I'm not built as a runner. I'm lucky. I always win my weight group. But I end up doing marathon because I couldn't do anything else because I was so physically hurt. But the running, and what I learned from my psychologist was repetitive activity is one of the things that helps reset when you're going through mental trauma. And that could be anything from knitting to walking to whatever. And as she said to me, trust you to go. I tell you to do something repetitive, so you choose to go and run a marathon. But I found that time alone, music, in running outside in the fresh air, and they're cathartic. It helped me to be able to think and plan and do what I needed to do selfishly, so that I could get myself better, because until I got better, I couldn't help my loved ones. And that's a whole other area that Alan's touched on, the importance of those people around you.
I'm interested in the role of family. One of the things I've raised, my wife and I have two beautiful kids and one other. Little joke. Nobody laughed. We've got three beautiful kids, but one thing that we raised our kids on was when things go wrong, there are three questions to ask. Is Jake okay? Is Louis okay? Is Billy okay? So my line for them was, if all three of you are okay, well, whatever's gone wrong, of a failed exam or this or that, it's not good. But it's, if you're physically okay and you're mentally you're well, the key is the family. In the audience now and the people that watch this, there will be people who have family members who are struggling. What is your advice to those family members? How do you deal with people within your family that were like you two, that had serious problems? What's the key values that the family should follow to help a family member that's struggling?
I would suggest first and foremost, if a mental illness is diagnosed, you research as much as you can about that illness, the symptoms, the ramifications of it, and what you can do to support that person. You have to develop an extraordinary level of patience. You have to stop asking yourself, how are you? I don't particularly like the "are you okay" philosophy, to be honest, Peter.
Why not?
I think certainly for Australian men, the first response will be, yeah, I'm okay.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I'd much rather you say, I'm worried about you. I see this and this. Things aren't right. What can I do to help? I care about you. You mean the world to me. So
just to follow up on what you'd said, within the family, you shouldn't be saying to the family member, how are you? How are you? Not too much of that?
No, it's very, when you're feeling so terrible, you don't want to say you're feeling terrible. You don't want to disappoint people. That I'd been going to see the psychiatrist for some time, and I'm quite sure Deb was expecting, hoping, praying that suddenly I was going to be better. And clearly I wasn't for a very long time. So, but just to say, I love you, I will do whatever it takes, I'm going to stick with you, we will get through this, is very important. But then the utilisation of what we in the sector know as lived experience, specific positive lived experience, where people have recovered from mental illnesses, that have overcome their suicidal ideation or their suicide attempt, have completely recovered from it. They give hope. And when you're in such a dire state of mental ill health or suicidal, to have some hope that you can get better is perhaps the only thing that's allowing you to dig your fingernails into and keep going. And I think we as a society have failed to capitalise on the knowledge of those who have recovered and how we can utilise this knowledge.
Which is exactly what today's about.
Thank you.
Grant.
Quick straw poll of the audience. Who here's done a first aid course? Who's done a mental health first aid course?
I didn't know such things existed. I really didn't.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, in policing, we were always taught, you've got two of these, and one of these, use them in that order. So observations, listening, watching. As parents, as family, as loved ones, they're the first to see the changes in the loved one that has occurred, because we often don't. We're oblivious to it. But then how, as Allan said, how do you translate that to, and asking you, are you okay? Look, I think that's great in terms of broadening the awareness of mental health. But having lived in the States for quite a long time and just returned, something that stuck with me was an American say to me, you guys are so good, you always ask us how we are. Because that's what Australians we do. You walk past the street, I get a, how you going, mate? How are you? So we do that, and if someone asks me, how you going? I'm great. I never stop and go, oh, well, you wouldn't believe it last week, And people are like, oh, I haven't got the time for that. Yeah. So we kind of lose the significance of what that means. But the reason I asked about the mental health first aid course is this is where we need to go, because we need to be able to identify what are some of the the physical things that you can see and do, and what you're able to take from that, and like Allan said, understanding the various mental issues behind that, because no two mental health injuries are the same. They're all different, and they all need to be treated differently. So if we can encourage people in the workplace or even in the family home, like we do. We've all got our first aid kit there for when our kids, cut their fingers and do whatever, and we know what to do with resuscitation. Laurie Lawrence, in our ears all the time about Survive and all those great things, but we don't have anything about what happens if my child, my husband, my wife, my father has a mental illness. What do I don't know. And they're not come forward. They're not going to come forward. You're going to ask, are you okay? They're going to go, as you said, absolutely.
The Canadian Mental Health Commission has developed a little colour chart called the Mental Health Continuum. It divides your state of psychological health into 4 colours, and it lists symptoms and signs and all those things. And for me, it's this wonderful little tool that we need to use, where if I can go to Grant and say, mate, I'm really worried about you, buddy. Things just don't seem right. I reckon you're an orange today, probably into the red. What do you reckon you are? All Grant has to do is just point. Doesn't have to say anything, just point. And I know automatically where he's at. If I've got the knowledge and the skills and the tools to provide sometimes immediate crisis care to Grant, that makes a huge difference. He knows that I care about him. He knows that I know my stuff, and he knows what to do. And just to have that pressure taken off you when you are so unwell can mean the difference between living and dying. It can be that crucial.
All right, can I invite questions from the audience? Yes, that you'd like. If you just compose a few questions, we have their level of expertise. Yes, you go, sir.
So with the experience you've had, you've been able to see in other people, wouldn't you?
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
The experience you've had, you're able to see it in first hand, can't you? You can
Absolutely.
pick it. And the thing is, you can give them that opportunity to stop the stigma, because it's very big in corporates and work. And especially if you're married too, you're worried whether your partner or wife will support you, because you've got to have that strength and respect, isn't it? You're afraid of losing the respect. I know you're nodding because you know what I'm saying is true.
And for me, it's how do we as a society prevent people from getting to that state?
Yep.
We have always had a reactive approach to mental illness in the Western world.
Exactly, instead of being proactive.
And in reality is we don't have the resources to manage on a reactive approach. So we have to swing the wheel around and educate people, give them the knowledge and the skills so they don't go down that path. And then we may have an ability to match the need with the resources that we currently have.
Yep. But it also takes time. It's not something that we can sit here today and then resolve tomorrow. Change in any culture is difficult. I mean, remember though, when we had to all wear compulsory seatbelts, remember how long that took to get people to do that? And that's a simple thing like that. But the thing, we've got to keep trying, got to keep moving, and what Allan does is absolutely fantastic, and I'm a great admirer of his. And we've got to get out there and we've got to send that message to people, but not be afraid to stand up and send that message. But also don't be afraid to say, I actually do need some help.
Yeah. All right, here's a question.
Perfect segue. And thank you so much for sharing the stories. The question I've got is, the men that leave this room today, what is the one thing that they could do to shift culture? Because it's so endemic at home and outside and at work. So what is one thing?
What's endemic? Depression or not talking about it?
Stigma.
Right.
Yeah.
Go on.
I am a great believer in my 3 foundation stones. Sleep. I set my technology to give me 8 hours sleep a night. That's my benchmark. If I'm not getting 8 hours good sleep a night, I know psychologically I'm going to suffer, and physically I'm going to suffer even more. Second is my nutrition, what I eat. What I eat affects not only me physically but also psychologically. 5 months ago, my wife and I removed basically processed carbs from our diet. The difference it's made to us physically and psychologically is mind-blowing. And the third is going from sedentary to moving to exercise. Moving is for health, exercise is for fitness. We aren't moving today. We need to move more, then we need to build up on that movement into exercise. And exercise is shown scientifically to reduce the symptoms and the trauma of mental illness. So they're my 3 foundation stones that I live by: sleeping well, eating properly, and exercising hard. At 60 years of age, I still play physical sport. I love what I do, and I know that keeps me grounded and keeps me really fit and healthy. If there's one of those 3 that I'd say is the most important, it's sleep.
Yep.
Yeah, we are not sleeping enough. Our children are not sleeping enough. As adults, we're not sleeping enough. I'd never understood the danger of sleep deprivation and how catastrophic it is to our physical and mental health. And if I had a magic wand and somebody said, "Al, you have the power for one wish," I would say, I want our world to sleep twice as much as we are. And we would halve the mental health problems in this country.
Grant, do you have similarly foundation stones?
Not so much foundation stones, but what I would say is 2 things. 1, don't wait. And 2, the amount of times I've heard people say, "Oh, I just can't find the time."
Yep.
You can't find the time. You never will. We're all too busy. You've got to make the time. You've got to make the time to what's important in your life. And the only thing that you can control in this life is what you do as an individual. So if you wait and you can't find the time, you're never going to get anywhere. So you've got to, and this comes back to the selfishness. But it's not selfishness for you, it's selfishness for your family. Talk about it, Talk about the things that Allan spoke about nutrition, about sleep, because we are just becoming obsessed with the digital world. We're all too busy, we've got too much going on in our lives. But if you don't stop, take a breath and start to focus on yourself now, while you've got time, who knows where you may end up.
I might just say I totally agree on that. And again, I'm not a mental health expert, but I'll just say very quickly in terms of what Allan was saying about getting healthy. There was a brilliant book written on this 2 or 3 years ago. As a matter of fact, I wrote it. And in my thing, it was called The Great Aussie Bloke Slim Down. But I was like many former footballers, totally let myself go. Went from 114 kilograms for Test football to 152 kilograms, and it was a mate of mine who'll remain nameless. Let's just call him Dave the dentist, who looked at my weight and said, "Look around you." He said, "Tell me how many 75-year-old men there are with your weight." And I said, "None." He said, "Exactly. Get healthy, get fit." And the best thing that I did, and it was also for my mental health, was to know myself, to stop the grog. So I haven't had a drink. I couldn't say exactly how long, but I think 4 years, 2 months and 4 days. But I don't, the point is, my constituency is not alcoholics. I was lucky not to be an alcoholic. I could have kept pace with an alcoholic on a bad day. But my breakthrough personally was understanding that it is easier to stop the grog entirely than to be moderation. There are many people who can drink moderately. I'm not one of them. I love it. Absolutely love it. But now that I've given it up, I don't miss it. And so for me, I think one of my things, we were talking about it in the car, I always thought people that talked about grog would change your mood, your bullshit. And in fact, I found that absolutely the truth, that I'm so much mentally stronger and more productive without the grog. And the other thing is losing the weight and getting physically active. For me, huge.
There's also a thing not many people know about. It's called HPA, axis dysfunction. And essentially what it is your adrenal glands become overused and they're worn out. They can't produce the adrenaline and the chemicals and hormones that we need. And because we're under so much pressure today, we're under fear and threat, our adrenal glands are failing us. And when you research this, you realise what it does to our bodies physically, which can then lead to a terrible psychological breakdown. So this is the information that we need to get out, particularly to our kids, and all of us, to understand what happens to us, essentially physically first of all, before we break down mentally. And that's where I think we can do so much good and change so much and make people so much healthier and happier and more positive, more resilient, if we understand the physiological processes involved, not just the psychological.
All right, other questions? Yes?
Can I just ask, it's a strange question, but was your recovery helped by what you had done in the past? I listened to you. I'm a teacher. and I could put you there as a couple of hero-type figures, bigger than life. You know, there's things that you've done, Afghanistan, working in the police force, and so on. And I ask this question because what about the ordinary person who hasn't done what you've done, who's suffering from depression, yet their lives are sort of, well, why? Where does it come from? We can understand and empathise maybe with what you have said. And we think, oh, this is amazing. Did that help you recover because you look back on what your life has been? And does that make a difference to the person who hasn't had those incredible highs, possibly, and lows that you've had? I don't know.
For me, everybody's life is unique and equal, if not more important than mine. Everybody contributes to our society in ways that most people don't even realise. I think that as cops, probably the core of a good cop is their willingness to care. They're willing to put themselves through hell and high water day after day because they care so much. They want to help people. And that can have some significant ramifications. But I think what we are failing to do is we are providing band-aids for some mental illnesses, as in antidepressants, without peeling back the person's life history and other causational aspects. It's, you've done the DAS5 test, you've got mild, moderate, severe depression, antidepressant, which will perhaps help to temper the symptoms of depression without going back into why is this person depressed? You know, and the same with suicide. Why does a person want to kill themselves? Let's look at the why factor. So if we peel back a person's life, their lifestyle, their behaviours, we may be able to find causational factors that we can address that will assist that person to have the skills to either manage or recover from their mental illnesses. It doesn't matter what we did as cops that may have caused our illnesses. I think we all, in today's world, we can all be susceptible to chronic stress. And that just doesn't come with one particular occupation.
I might throw that to Grant. When confronted with chronic stress, what's your advice for those that are really just, I can't cope, I cannot cope?
Again, it's always hard when you're in the throes of that, but the answers are there when you look back. And going to your point, sure, you know, Allan and I, we've done some unique things, but we're also fathers, brothers, you know, son. We've looked after our kids. We have done things, and I listen to myself sometimes, and I said, I wish I had to listen to myself more when I was going through those throws, because you know I had the answers there in bringing up my children and giving them advice, in giving, you know, coaching kids in football and sport and things like that. But I could never make that translation. So irrespective of where you sit in this life, I mean, I think without a doubt, if I asked what was the greatest achievement of most people in this room, they'd say my children, you know. We all have that in common. I mean, what we do in our own vocations are over and above that. But my advice is, you know, when you're in the throes of that where you can, one of the resiliency tools is taking what you've done in life and be grateful and be proud and be honest of it. And it doesn't matter what you do in your career or what have you. Look at the things that have made you happy in your life and cherish those moments and use that as a circuit breaker to break.
Right. Okay. I think time for one more question. There was yes in the front row that took the first aid course. I like that.
So my background is a researcher, so I'm just about to put you on the spot here to answer a question. I'm trained in suicide intervention, and it's a co-design. So basically, I'm trained to notice people who may be at risk of suicide. So if there'd been somebody in your lives at that point where you were considering suicide that asked you directly, you know, are you thinking about killing yourself? Would you have responded yes to that? Like, what would you have done in that situation?
Well, we've only got 2 minutes, so you go.
When I was walking to the bathroom to end my life and a colleague came in and took the gun from me, he said, "Are you okay?"
There you go. It was a good question. I knew it was a good question.
Clearly I was about to do something. And I said, no, mate, I'm expletive. And he said, okay, well, we better take you home. So he drove me home, let me jump out of the car and said, good luck, mate, and left me there. So had somebody said before then, if my wife had been able to pick up the signs, which I was so good at masking, there was no way she was ever going to find out.
Yeah.
Had she said, Al, are you thinking of killing yourself? I probably would have said, nah, are you kidding me? I would have got very angry, very defensive. But I know that for some, it is a circuit breaker. And for some, it will prevent that.
All right. I've got time for Grant to answer quickly too.
Same. If someone asked me, I would have said no, absolutely not. But if someone was skilled enough at looking at me physically and knowing what was going on, they would have known that what was coming out of my mouth didn't match what was going on between my ears.
All right. I speak on behalf of all three of us. I hope that the lessons learnt, the wisdom imparted has been helpful to people here and the people that will watch it. But for those in the audience, please thank Allan and Grant.
Thanks very much, Alan.